Good evening, and welcome to a Cape Ann conversation with Bill McKibben. I'm Beth Pocock, the Assistant Director at the Sawyer Free Library, and the library is hosting this conversation tonight along with the Bridge Cape Ann, the Boston Globe, and many partnering local organizations. We're grateful to all of you who've tuned in to listen to it tonight. In 1989, Bill McKibben published his book, The End of Nature, which really became the first book on global warming to reach a popular audience. That book was part of a national awakening to the dangers of our warming planet. And now many articles, books, lectures, awards, and trips around the globe later, Bill has become one of the world's most passionate and articulate spokesmen concerning the climate crisis. David Abel, who will be interviewing Bill tonight, is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who writes on environmental issues for the Boston Globe. He's also a filmmaker who has recently produced a film concerning climate change entitled Entangled. And off the record, David claims Bill as one of his heroes. Both these men are familiar with the specific climate issues facing Boston and the North Shore. For those of us who live here, climate change is no longer a debatable issue. We can see the effects of the rising ocean and the warming waters for ourselves. It's a topic of great urgency for us. It affects our homes, our families, and our livelihoods. So tonight, we're very grateful to be able to listen in on this Cape Ann conversation with Bill McKibben and David Abel.
Well, I just want to start by saying how great it is to talk to Bill McKibben, someone who's been a hero of mine for many years as a fellow journalist and most importantly, a truth teller. We've all had a hard time this year, but Bill, you've had a particularly rough few months. You had a bike accident that led to a broken shoulder, I believe, and ribs. So before we talk about the plight of the world, the wildfires in the West, the droughts here in New England, the 5 hurricanes now churning through the Atlantic, and the glaciers detaching from Antarctica, to name but a few, the most important question I have right now is this: how are you feeling?
Well, put that way, I'm feeling great. I mean, compared to everything else that's happened in 2020, my problems are tiny, but it's kind of you to ask, and I go in for surgery tomorrow, and we'll see if they can put my shoulder back together. But the ribs are pretty well healed up, so they can do anesthesia, and we'll see. But I'm cognizant that compared with just about everybody else, I've had a really easy time, including with the pandemic. The differences between being a freelance writer who lives in the woods in Vermont and being in isolation are minimal. so it's been less of an upset to my way of life than almost anybody else, I think.
Right, and you noted shortly before, as we were talking, that Vermont has been fortunate to have very few cases. So that at least has been a perk for you, I hope.
No, absolutely. And actually, I think it sort of bears on some of this large. I've been doing a little bit of writing for the New Yorker about trying to figure out why Vermont's been actually luckier than any place else in the country. And I think it actually has at least something to do with the kind of levels of social trust and social capital that are higher here than by surveys and things any place else in the country. And I think in turn that illuminates some of the reasons that we've had trouble as a nation coping with the warnings about things like climate change.
Let me just ask you on the accident, how has it affected your work and your writing?
I've gotten better at dictation, but I've been able to keep, the one thing I do absolutely every week is this free newsletter through the New Yorker about climate change. And I've seemed to have been able to keep producing that. And that's, I've wanted to, because we're living through 31 years ago now, I wrote the first book about all this. And we're now kind of living through precisely what we were predicting back then. And so it feels important to kind of keep chronicling it and keep suggesting to people that we still have a few ways to keep it from getting worse than it has to get.
Well, I want to talk about that, but I just want to also note that and ask you a little bit about another fall, as you described it in Rolling Stone a few months back, when you were drawn into the crosshairs of Michael Moore, who made a litany of specious claims in his film Planet of the Humans. You were cast as something of his chief foil, essentially a fraud or hypocrite, or what you memorably called in that piece a forest raping sellout. I don't want to dwell on the absurdities of his many erroneous claims, which you and many others have refuted, but I want to ask how that saga has played out for you, and whether he ever apologized, acknowledged his errors, or responded to you in any way.
No, not as far as I know, and it was difficult and odd to be. I mean, it's difficult and odd, I suppose, to be attacked at any time, but to be attacked for the exact opposite of the things that you've been doing is strange. You know, I mean, I've been a volunteer in the environmental movement from the beginning. That's been work, and our work has been largely standing up to Wall Street. The fossil fuel divestment movements become the largest anti-corporate campaign in history. I think we're at $14.5 trillion now in endowments and portfolios that have divested. So to be accused of being somehow a sellout to Wall Street or something is odd, but I think it probably just goes to demonstrate the kind of strangeness of our political moment. And it's not clear to me that there's a huge difference sometimes between the very far right and the very far left around things. I don't know. I've done my best to just keep going on and doing what we need to do every day.
And just because so many people have actually seen that film, which was on YouTube, but I think pulled off YouTube, right? I just wonder if you could respond to his central claim that renewable energy is some kind of sham, and that the environmental movement is some kind of tool of corporations trying to make money off green energy.
Yeah. So renewable energy, I mean, the central factual problem with the movie was not all the, sort of things they got wrong about me or whatever. It's that it was relentlessly out of date, like by a decade, about solar power and wind power. And the problem with being out of date by a decade is the last decade's been the key decade. I mean, the price of solar power and wind power has dropped by 90% in the last 10 years. It's become the cheapest way to generate power on the planet. And hence it's being, in countries that are thinking sensibly about public policy, it's being adopted left, right, and center. And, it's not that we have exactly technological solutions to our problems, but there's no question that technology is a big part of the solution. If we're going to stop burning coal, gas, and oil, which we absolutely have to do, and we're going to keep having lives that look anything like the lives we live at the moment, then we're going to need power. And the place that it's mostly going to come from going forward is the sun and the wind.
And this is the last question on the Moore saga. You worried in your Rolling Stone piece about whether the film might somehow divide the environmental movement and make your work of building that movement harder or less effective. Has it? Have there been any material or lasting consequences? Do you see more cynicism or nihilism as you feared?
I actually don't think so. It seems not to have. The fans of it seem to have come mostly from sort of the climate denying side of the world, who are already entrenched in their position. The fossil fuel industry's done what it can to kind of spread it around. But I don't think truthfully, I think at this point, the sheer demonstration of what Mother Nature is doing is overriding kind of all other factors at the moment. And as Mother Nature draws our attention to where we are, I think that there's now enough of a movement built that people kind of are falling in behind it and beginning to move in the right directions. And much of that built, it must be said, by people in the Bay State. One of the really great leaders at the moment is a young woman from East Boston. You must have come across in your work, Varshini Prakash, head of the Sunrise Movement, and really the chief advocate in the whole country for the Green New Deal. And it's been beautiful to watch people starting to really respond to that idea. And I think as we enter into what's correctly a state of panic about where we are now, that we're going to be reaching for those ideas that people have put forward. And that's a key one. It was probably not lost on anybody in DC that it was those kids from the Sunrise Movement and younger, a lot of high school students too, that took Ed Markey from 17 points down to 10 points up over the Kennedy dynasty, earlier this month. People in Washington may not know a lot about energy or science, but every single person there is an absolute expert and specialist on getting elected. And so I bet that they paid serious attention to the fact that it was Ed Markey running on the Green New Deal that really captured that race.
Yeah, it's true. I wrote a postmortem of the race, and without the support from the environmental community, I'm not sure he would have been able to reverse that toll that he had been at, and also overcome the Kennedy mystique. And
what's interesting is famously, I was writing about this in the New Yorker this week. His great uncle Jack Kennedy was literally the definition of cool. That's how Marshall McLuhan sort of first defined hot and cool, in the TV age. And that Ed Markey became the cool person in that Senate race was a fairly remarkable turn of events. And it was entirely down to young people. And what they were mostly motivated by was a demand for action around climate change. And even the ones who couldn't vote, the tons of high school students who were kind of making up the Markeyverse, I think created a kind of profound permission structure for their parents and grandparents to turn away from the Kennedys and look somewhere else.
It is comical to those of us who've followed Markey, the wonky, perhaps among the most wonky of politicians, to be a cool.
Kyle Icahn.
But it's true, as you were saying, that what fueled his campaign really was an environmental movement predicated on the question: well, what happens if one of the co-author of the Green New Deal goes down? And that was what helped raise a lot of money for him, frankly.
Absolutely. And he had campaigning at his side the single most engaging political personality in America, in Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who again has, the single thing about which she is most known is this idea that we need a Green New Deal. And remember, these guys were promulgating the idea of a New Deal before our country fell into depression that it's now in, or deep recession or whatever we're technically calling it. All of a sudden,
I call it purgatory.
Yeah. All of a sudden, the argument for something that's going to be economically transformative is stronger than it was when they began.
On this topic of the movement, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what impact the pandemic has had on the challenges of trying to organize and focus attention on climate change. I mean, right now we're seeing these apocalyptic images from the West, and we're probably going to wake up tomorrow to seeing apocalyptic images from the Gulf Coast. But my question is, when issues of health and racial justice have been paramount and really sucked the airwaves, how difficult has it been to focus our collective attention as an organizer and activist on the climate issue?
Well, I think that rightly it's been more difficult. That we've had no choice but to pay attention to the pandemic, and thank God we've actually paid serious attention to these questions around racial justice. It's one's been proud of the country for coming together and taking seriously what's happened. I think that the important news is that both of those things help us understand this overarching crisis that's dominating this century around the globe. Think first about the pandemic. If you wanted to start taking lessons from it, one, physical reality is real, which is a trite thing to say, but actually in the world we live in, always abstracted by screens and things, it's easy to forget. So I've spent 30 years trying to convince people that physics and chemistry don't negotiate, don't compromise, you have to do what they say. That lesson, has been taught in spades for biology over the last 6 months. Doesn't matter if the president says, oh, it's a hoax, or it's going to disappear by Easter, or, blah, blah, blah. The microbe's calling the shots. If it says stand 6 feet apart and wear masks, then do it, As a corollary to that, and with powerful extension to the climate question, we've really figured out that speed matters. US and South Korea had their first COVID case on the same day in January. South Koreans went to work. They flattened the curve. They really did. And it's not over there, but they didn't have to destroy their economy, and they're kind of looking at it in the rearview mirror, and people are able to go to the karaoke bar and, whatever. We now know, thanks to Bob Woodward, that that though we knew everything about it for, even at the top levels all through February and March, we didn't do a damn thing. And so it got away from us, and so now we have a huge pile of dead bodies and sick people and economic devastation. Well, the equivalent to February and March in climate terms is the last 30 years. We've ignored the scientific warning, and so things have gotten away from us. And now we need to move with extraordinary speed, and we can talk more about that. The third thing, though, that I think is really key is that the pandemic reminded us that social solidarity matters. I came of political age in the shadow of Ronald Reagan as he changed America's political ethos. And his biggest argument was government is the problem, not the solution. Markets solve all problems. Reagan's greatest laugh line was always, the 9 scariest words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Yeah. Ha, ha, ha. The scariest words in the English language are either, we've run out of ventilators, or the hillside behind your house is currently on fire, And neither of those yield to market forces. They require, that we figure out how to work together on things, that we rebuild the governments that we've allowed to atrophy, that we take those steps. Similarly, with this summer of racial reckoning, the most important words of 2020, sadly, came from George Floyd, I can't breathe. But once we started thinking about that, we were reminded that people can't breathe for lots of reasons. There's a cop with a knee on their neck, or their community is stifled by police brutality. But precisely the same kind of communities are the ones that are likely to have a coal-fired power plant someplace in the neighborhood. The asthma rate for Black Americans is 3 times what it is for white Americans. People can't breathe this week because wildfire smoke has turned the air quality in the West Coast worse than any place on the planet. Portland, Oregon has air that's people in Beijing and New Delhi would think is terrible today. People can't breathe because it's gotten too damn hot. And it's always the same people who suffer the most. I mean, the iron law of climate change is the less you did to cause it, the more you suffer. So I think that reckoning around justice is as important for the climate movement as is anything else.
Let me just ask you though, you made a very crystal clear case about how facts should matter. And my question is more of on the political front about what happens when they don't matter to 40% or 43 or 45% of the electorate, those that don't seem to care that the president clearly lied about the pandemic, and also, just today and yesterday repeated, that climate change is a myth, essentially. And how do you make the case to those folks who we need to get across the goal line any serious political challenge to this crisis that you have been, calling attention to for decades now?
Well, I mean, the first answer to that question is, before anybody gets persuaded, the job on November 3rd is to beat them, because nothing's going to happen around climate change, around racial justice, and probably around any of us ever being able to walk outside without a mask again, unless we, get past the trouble of having a amoral buffoon running the country. I mean, it just turns out to have been a poor idea on any number of counts. But the good news around climate change, and this really has shifted over the last 10, 15, 20 years, is that we're really at the point now where something like 70% of Americans understand that it's a serious issue, want the government to do more about it, are ready for action. And that includes a not insubstantial proportion of Republicans as well as Democrats. And in the country as divided as we are, that's really not that bad. I mean, 70% is a fairly good margin. Even better is the fact that when we poll about renewable energy, we find that there's really no person or idea that polls as well among Republicans, Democrats, and independents. Something like 80% of each group want more government support for more renewable energy. I think for different reasons. I think in the conservative mindset, you get a solar panel on your roof and you're free from having to ever think about the rest of anybody else ever again. So, you're in your castle or your fortress and you're good. And if you're a liberal, like it's groovy that the warm power of the sun is now, running your life, whatever. We can work with that. I think there's room going forward. What there's not room for, and the reason that we have to get out of power, the people who are there now, is for the fossil fuel industry to continue politically dominating this debate. That's what really the story of the last 30 years has been about. We've really only understood its true dimension because of great investigative reporting over the last 5 or 6 years.
I just want to refine my question slightly to ask this. In trying to persuade those who either agree with the president that it's a hoax or don't care enough, and whether that number is 30%, or I think it depends on how you ask the question in a poll. But there's a sizable population that just resists the notion that either climate change is real or that it's something that we really need to deal with. My question is, what do you think is the most effective way to talk to folks like that? What is the message that might, possibly, you know, change minds or at least, you know, find common ground?
Well, so depends on who your listener is. If they come from a religious background, sometimes it's possible to get people to pay attention to figures like the Pope, who have been remarkably outspoken and sharp in their critique of what we're doing. Laudato Si, the papal encyclical on climate change, really is a kind of thoroughgoing critique of modernity and the most important, in some ways, document of the 21st century, I think. If people have a military connection and a kind of allegiance to the US military, the fact that the Pentagon takes climate change with enormous seriousness sometimes is able to get through. But I don't think that the biggest task is taking that 30 or 35% and converting them. I'm not sure that in most cases it's possible. I think that if you'd spent the last 3 decades marinating in Rush Limbaugh, you'd have a hard time making this switch. I don't think that people are just waiting for the next issue of Science or Nature and it's like one more study and they're going to be good, you know? It's an ideological conviction. And so in my work as an organizer, the really important job is to take some percentage of that 70% and get them fully activated, engaged, willing to work. You know, we've learned a lot.
Let me just narrow the question slightly and just ask it this way. I'm sure you come into contact, as I do repeatedly, with people who say that, you know, you're just, you know, blowing hot air and that this isn't really a problem. How do you speak to someone who says this is bogus?
Well, I mean, you can do what you can do. I mean, I've written book after book, and you know, and to some degree it works. You know, there are people who, but what I'm trying to tell you is that a certain number of the people who are saying that are not saying it because they have any interest in changing. They're saying it because, I mean, they're saying it because one of our political parties has been owned by the fossil fuel industry for a number of years now. And if you've just sworn complete and utter allegiance to that political party and that political movement, then it's extremely hard to psychologically break with what's going on. And if you live in a world where your media diet is mostly, say, Fox News, and you listen to, say, Tucker Carlson last night explaining that that climate change was like systemic racism in the sky, something that doesn't exist, but that liberals want to use to grab power from you, then, you know, that's, it's, I think you're asking in the end slightly the wrong question. I think the more interesting question is, how do you figure out how to make some part of that 70% really engaged? Because what we've learned about movements over the last some years, including from the great Massachusetts-based political scientist Erica Chenoweth, is that you don't need 50% of people to make change. History seems to indicate that if you can get 4 or 5% of people deeply engaged in a movement, you'll usually win. And the reason for that is that apathy cuts both ways, you know? I mean, I can tell you that getting, say, 400,000 people out in the street for the first huge climate march in New York 5 years ago, that took a huge amount of work, and we worried about everything, were there enough toilets, what would, you know, on and on and on. The one thing we didn't worry about was that the next day, 400,000 people would come out and parade around, you know, demanding more global warming. So that's the, I mean, I think that's the key question.
And I understand that. The question that you answered is more along the lines of how do you mobilize change and a movement. And what I was more asking on that front was, how do you talk to your neighbor who how do you
No,
just reach across the
I give you my
divide?
best suggestions, but my real response is don't destroy Thanksgiving arguing with your crazy uncle about climate change, because it's probably not going to work. But it is worthwhile telling your sweet aunt what it is you're working on, and asking her if, she might tell her Facebook friends about the, nifty project that her grandkids are working on around the Green New Deal or whatever it is.
Okay, that's a good response. All right, I want to talk about just the pandemic on another level. I wonder if, in any odd way, there's been any benefit to the environmental movement from the pandemic, in that it, in some ways, may have, although it doesn't seem to have derailed them, diverted the Trump administration's attention from their deregulatory agenda. And obviously it has persisted and it's been relentless. But were there things that
this would suppose that they'd actually spent some time and energy working on the pandemic, which does not seem to have been the case. So,
well, there were those press conferences that the president attended in the first month or two.
But I tell you what I think's been interesting about the pandemic, and a really useful piece of information that it's provided. I mean, look, we came through. This is the biggest change in daily life by far in your or my lifetime, right? I mean, and really in anybody's lifetime, at least as far back as World War II, just in terms of how our daily lives have been. I mean, it's been, we locked down the economy. I don't know anybody who got an airplane for months, people stopped commuting. And so emissions dropped something like 10% maybe at their height, which isn't bad. I mean, that's, a lot, but it's not that much. And I think what it really kind of helped demonstrate is something useful, which is, yeah, it's important to be doing all you can in your individual lives to deal with climate change, but most of the damage is hardwired into the system. And so we're going to have to go into the system and pull out its guts, pull out the coal and gas and oil, and stuff in a huge amount of efficiency and sun and wind.
On that shutdown and the carbon reduction, do you think that it in any way possibly bought us some time to offset the damage of the last few years, or not really?
It doesn't seem to have. We seem to, I mean, emissions seem to be bouncing back very fast. Story today in The Economist said Chinese emissions were already up above where they were this time last year. Traffic outside London was worse than it was, before the pandemic, on and on and on. So I'm afraid it didn't do that. And I do think that there is, that you alluded to the danger of a kind of waste of time, and that's very real. I mean, the thing to remember about climate change that separates it from every other political problem that we deal with is that it has a sharp time limit. We don't get to just keep nibbling away at it year after year after year. If we don't solve it soon, we don't solve it because we go past these tipping points from which there's no return. And we actually have a good sense of what that is now. I mean, the IPCC, the International Panel of Scientists who study climate, in their last report in October of 2018, said that if we hadn't made fundamental transformation of our energy system by 2030, and they defined fundamental transformation essentially as cutting emissions in half, then our chance of meeting the targets we set at Paris was essentially nil. So that's a hard deadline in the sense of hard and fast, and it's a hard deadline in the sense of it's at the bleeding edge of the technically possible that we could even get there. But at least we have a kind of marching orders now.
I want to take a pause from these bigger issues and talk about you a little bit and your background, and how a kid from Lexington, Massachusetts, whose dad was once the business editor at my newspaper, the Boston Globe, got into journalism, and then became arguably the nation's leading environmental advocate. Can you tell us how you went to writing for the Harvard Crimson to your first job being at the New Yorker?
Well, my dad was a journalist and a wonderful journalist, and he loved the Globe. And I, of course, grew up venerating the Globe in its greatest glory days with Tom Winship at the helm, and I went to work for the Lexington Minuteman, the town newspaper, when I was 14, writing high school sports for 25 cents a column inch, which may explain why I'm, tend to rattle on, rather more than I should sometimes.
I'd like to say they pay us more than that now, but it's probably not that much better.
and so then I did go to college at Harvard, and all I did at Harvard was write for the Crimson, which is, in those days anyway, was a 6-day-a-week operation. And I covered Cambridge politics. And in those days, Cambridge was the biggest city in America without a daily newspaper of its own. So I had the pleasure of kind of being the daily newspaper for covering Cambridge City Council, and it was a great pleasure. I really enjoyed those years a lot. And then as you say, I went to
Globe, by the way, is traditionally not covered Cambridge very closely. When I was actually hired at the Globe 20 years ago, they brought me in this. That was at the pinnacle of newspapers in the late 90s, early 2000s, when we were flush with cash, and they brought me in to cover Harvard, just Harvard. That was my beat initially, and it was an interesting experience. Didn't last that long, but we don't have that pleasure anymore.
I hate to say it, but that confirms what a lot of Cambridge thinks about what the Globe thinks.
Sure.
Yeah, no.
We do now have the biotech. We do now have the biotech industry, which we also cover quite
a little more than 02138. And the
right.
So I went from there off to the New Yorker, where I wrote the talk of the town for 5 years and wrote most of it in those days.
Which, by the way, is remarkable for anyone listening. Is a remarkable step for being a student and then going right to the New Yorker. How did you make that leap?
And in those days, I could sort of get away with writing a lot of it because it was anonymous. So I think now people might think it's kind of weird if the 21-year-old was writing most of the, but no one knew. So, and I enjoyed it immensely. I wrote a long piece for the New Yorker, the first long piece I wrote when I was 23 or 24, where I traced where everything in my apartment came from. So all the line, I followed the electric line. Con Ed was buying oil from Brazil. So I was down in the jungle in Brazil. I mean, the New Yorker was flush with money in those days too. And I was up in the Arctic at the big hydroelectric dam in Hudson Bay, because the Con Ed was getting power there. And, I was followed the gas lines down to the Gulf of Mexico and the sewer and the water and so on and so forth. And in retrospect, it was really important for me because, I was a good child of the suburbs, and the suburbs are well designed to make you forget about the physical operation of the planet. Who knows where the water is or the, what happens to anything? It's all hidden away and so on. And so it left me with this strong sense that, and sort of shocking sense for me, that even a place like Manhattan that seems able to kind of mint money, and ideas out of thin air, was exquisitely dependent on the operations of the physical world to let it keep going. And I think that set me up over the next few years in the late 80s as I started to read the early climate science in various journals and things. really set me up to understand it in a different way, to have a more visceral sense of the fragility of arrangements here on the planet. And it, frankly, it didn't, I mean, it scared me some. And that was one of the motivations. And then by the time I wrote The End of Nature, when I was 27 or 28, I'd quit the New Yorker because they fired Mr. Sean, the editor, so I got angry and quit. And I'd moved out to the wilderness.
Why did that bother you? What was the motivation to, that's not a very common thing
Oh,
for
I just get
a young
angry.
reporter to.
You know, I was just, you know, I mean, you know, he was the greatest editor of the 20th century. The whole thing, you know, I thought like the corporate, you know, they got bought by a big corporation. I was like, you know, and I mean, I wasn't married. I didn't have kids, you know, so it wasn't like, you know. So anyway, I happily ended up living in the Adirondacks, deep in the wilderness, really quite remote place, and was falling in love with this wilderness around me. Really very striking. So along with the fear, the other emotion of The End of Nature, really the dominant one, was a kind of sadness at the idea that this wilderness I was falling in love with was not as wild as it appeared, you know, that already its temperature and hence its flora and its fauna and things were beginning to shift. You know, there's a great quote from that great Massachusetts son of Massachusetts, Mr. Thoreau. He said once, he said he could walk to a place where no man stood from one year's end to another, and hence their politics were not, for politics are but the cigar smoke of a man, which is a good line. And you know, in the Adirondacks, I could walk out my back door and within half an hour be in places I don't know if anybody had ever stood before, you know. But the sort of cigar smoke of our society was there. It was shifting around me. So those were the things that kind of undergirded the writing of that book, The End of Nature. And then the fact that it did, you know, it was the first book about this and did very well. I guess in a way, it just, I've sort of never left, in a certain sense, this problem. I think I understood journalistically that climate change was the biggest story of my lifetime, even if no one else really seemed to think so or care for a while. And it's provided ways to think about and look at the world for the next 30 years. So it hasn't yet run out of juice for me.
When you look back at that first book, The End of Nature, which you wrote in 1989, and the premise was how much Mother Nature was being altered by human beings, is there anything at all you regret, or anything that's changed that maybe, like, when you look back on that? Because when I look back on any earlier writing, it always makes me cringe a little bit. Is there anything that you feel like missed the mark in that book, or it was the opposite, that, you know, really?
There's plenty of writing in it. There's probably some writing in it that's pretty jejune and so on. Sadly, the science was just, you know, proved to be right. I mean, my reading of, I mean, and in those days, I could only have written that book when I did, because in 1989, I could fit all the science about climate change on the top of my desk. I mean, that's how many articles, monographs, whatever you had to master in order to understand what was going on. Now you could fill 3 hangars at Hanscom Field with, you know, the publications around climate change. But the truth is, very little has changed in our understanding of this. The only thing the only 2 things that have changed, I think, are: one, it turns out that scientists were by their nature conservative and underestimating both the speed and the scale of the damage. And 2, the one thing we really hadn't figured in, and this is important for those of you in Cape Ann, no one had figured out that the ocean chemistry was going to be wrecked in the way that it has. People weren't, I really think it hadn't occurred to anyone that that you could dramatically alter the chemistry of seawater just because there was so damn much of it, you know. But what do you know? It turns out you can. You can acidify the ocean. But those are the only. So those were the things that I got wrong, I guess, in the book. But the thing that I got wrong in my mind was that I mean, remember, I was 27, 28 at the time, so still very naive about the world. And I was operating on the theory that we were engaged in an argument, and that if we piled up enough data and reason and things, enough papers, enough books, that our leaders would then do the things that needed doing to deal with the inevitable logical outcome of all this information. And that just proved me wrong. So it took me a good decade to figure out what I should have known from the beginning, which was that we were not in an argument. We'd won the argument. The science was clear. We were in a fight. And the fight was what fights are always about: money and power, not data and reason. And the other side in this fight, the fossil fuel industry, was using its endless money. At the time, it was the richest industry in the world, to completely dominate this fight and win it. And so that was the point when my life started shifting from just writing to trying to figure out how to organize. I knew enough about American history to know that on occasion, people, if they joined together in large enough numbers, could make up for overwhelming amounts of money and power by sheer number of bodies. So that's what we tried.
And I just want to have you pause that thought to just interject this question, which is, which is where you're going. But I'm curious, as a newspaper journalist, you've started out as a journalist and you're still a journalist, and you managed to do something that very few journalists do, which is wear two hats. And you're a writer and a journalist and an activist. How a lot of journalists would consider that apostate. Can you talk about, as you were starting to do, how you made that transition, whether you had to give up anything to do that as a writer, and what the trade-offs are of wearing both hats?
So I knew by the time that I was writing The End of Nature that I wasn't objective in the sense that I very much cared about the outcome of this question. I mean, I did not want the planet to burn up. So I wasn't, I suppose in that sense, taken sides. And I knew enough about journalism. I mean, remember, this was the world I'd grown up in, to know that that meant I couldn't go be the beat reporter covering climate change, I remember that, when I left the New Yorker, when I quit the New Yorker, the Times tried to hire me. And I just knew that that was not going to work in that way. So I've been very clear in my journalism ever since to always identify myself for what I am, someone who cares about the outcome of this question, and so I've been able to keep doing a different kind of journalism for a long time, with, I think, impact in its own way,
You went on to form 350.org, which took its name from what was considered a safe concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's a kind of esoteric name that wouldn't mean much to a lot of people. Why'd you decide to name the movement that? And does it feel outdated today now that we're at about 412 parts per trillion of carbon dioxide?
We picked the name for really two reasons. One, we wanted to organize globally. This was the first iteration of a kind of global climate movement a decade ago. And we figured that Arabic numerals work better than words, English phrases. And so it turned out to be. I mean, we've organized rallies in every country on earth except North Korea. And two, we thought it was important to get across the fact that this was not a prospective problem, but one that we were already at. And people said, oh, it's going to be too sad for people that it's too dark, you're already past 350, it seems so depressing. And that's, I mean, there's some truth to that, but there's also the way in which, if a doctor says to you, oh, keep eating like this and someday you'll get heart disease, you don't pay any attention. But if the doctor takes your cholesterol and says, your cholesterol's right in the zone where people you might have already had a little stroke yourself, that's the moment when you're like, okay, what pill am I supposed to take? You start taking things seriously. And that's where we were. It wasn't too hard or esoteric for people to understand because, all it is a number like cholesterol where there's too little, here's how much and that's too much. And, only an idiot goes home from the doctor and like searches for websites that say cholesterol doesn't exist or something, I mean, so that was the hope. And it worked pretty well. I mean, our first big day of action in 2009, we managed to have 5,200 simultaneous demonstrations in 181 countries. CNN called it the most widespread day of political action in the planet's history. Now, a lot of them are small, 100 people here and there, but you have to start somewhere. And the good news is that, now people have just cascaded in. We have, the Sunrise Movement with the Green New Deal. We have Extinction Rebellion. We have most beautifully high school kids around the world, those kind of Fridays for the Future, all the kind of versions of Greta Thunberg that exist in every continent and every city. So now it's arguably the biggest movement that there is, and it's begun to take a real dent out of the political power of the fossil fuel industry, which has been the goal all along. It has to be, because we can't get meaningful change as long as they're running the show.
Well, let's talk about what meaningful change means. And I just want to say that one of the pieces you wrote that I read just as I was starting on the climate beat a little less than a decade ago, I think it was 2012, you wrote this terrific essay called "The Terrifying New Math of Global Warming" for Rolling Stone. And that was really probably for me the first time I read in very crystal clear, straightforward, easy to understand numerical terms what we were up against essentially in terms of climate change. And you discussed the imperative of limiting warming to 2 degrees Celsius. My question is, do you still see that as within the realm of possible, or are we already blowing past that?
No, look, it would take everything we've got to stop short of it. But it is very much within the realm of the possible, more than it was 10 years ago. Because 10 years ago, sun and wind were expensive. And now they're cheap. They're the cheapest way to generate power around the world. So the economics of all of this is way different. 10 years ago, we had to do it, but it wasn't clear that we could. Who own oil wells and coal mines and are desperate that we not get off their product. So that's been what the fight for the last decade is about, try to limit their political power. And one of the ways to do that was to keep, the reason that article in Rolling Stone was, in some ways the most important thing I ever wrote, because it became the kind of launching pad for this divestment movement. And that in turn has been a big help in limiting the power of this industry.
If you read The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells, he sees 4 degrees as very likely, which was, not too long ago, the worst case scenario. you know,
I just reviewed Mark Linus's new book for the New York Review of Books, and he says his argument is that 6 degrees is about as, you know, our odds of reaching 6 degrees are about the same as reaching 1.5, which is the target we set in Paris.
right.
That's pretty scary.
Yeah, I can't even imagine what a world of 6 degrees Celsius looks like.
A world of 4 degrees Celsius won't have civilizations on it like the ones we're used to.
Right.
Let's put it like that.
I guess the question I have for you is, at this point, given the challenges that we've already seen, we did have this Paris Climate Accord, but I'm not sure what that's really, how effective that has been. Not, you know, not even referring to what the Trump administration has done, but you know, these voluntary sort of goals. There no enforcement mechanism. I guess my question is, you know, on balance, you know, you talk about 2 degrees Celsius as the threshold, but where do you think we're heading?
Well, right now, I mean, even if everybody in the world kept the promises we made at Paris, you can run it through a computer, and the computer's at MIT. I mean, it's the En-ROADS program that people there set up over the years. Sloan Center, I think. You come out at 3.5 degrees. I mean, that's even if we'd all kept our promises, which obviously our country hasn't. But Paris, we knew all along, you know, that the only hope was that it would serve as a kind of, we'd finally get a kind of virtuous feedback loop instead of the vicious feedback cycles we're engaged in now. And that, you know, and for a moment it seemed to be coming true, because the price of renewable energy was dropping so fast that we, you know, the move was palpable. That's why the election of Trump was such a incredibly ill-timed disaster, you know, because obviously he's done everything in his power to slow this down. And in doing so, he's given a good excuse for everybody else in the world to slow down too. If the country that put the most carbon in the atmosphere historically doesn't want to do anything about it, why should I have to in Peru or, you know, wherever? And there's really no particularly good answer to that question.
And just so it's concrete for people who might not understand very clearly what 2 degrees and 3 degrees or 3.5 degrees mean, can you just give us a sense of what's the difference between 1.5 degrees, which is the goal of Paris Climate Accord, and what 3.5 degrees?
I mean, the way to think about it is, so far we've gone up 1 degree. That's enough to melt most of the sea ice in the summer Arctic. That's enough to dramatically change the chemistry of the oceans. That's enough to explain why, I mean, that's enough to give us this summer the highest recorded temperature, reliably recorded temperature in Earth history, 130 degrees in California. That's enough to explain why 5 of the 10 largest fires in California history are currently burning, you know, on and on and on. So that's with 1 degree. If you go to 2 degrees, you don't get twice as much trouble. You get some multiple of that. I mean, we're talking about exponential change, not linear, because you keep going past those tipping points. So to think about it in kind of, I mean, you can think about it in all kinds of terms. You and your colleagues wrote that beautiful series about Cape Cod and climate change, you know? You can almost sit there and draw a map, like at 2 degrees, here's where the water is going to be coming through the middle. And, you know, climate change is a math problem at some level, you know, and the more carbon you pour in the atmosphere and the more the temperature goes up, the more the damage gets, because what you're doing is just putting more energy in a closed system. And we're putting lots of energy in. The extra heat that we trap near the planet because of the coal and gas and oil that we've burned is the rough heat equivalent of about 400,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs a day, okay? So just keep imagining all that heat all the time, and you get a sense of how it all adds up. So, you know, 1 degree is chaotic. 2 degrees is going to be take everything we've got to try and deal with it, I think. And much past that, I don't think we can deal with it. I think we move into a world where just emergency response is all we do until we run out of the means to respond in those ways.
I think the current IPCC forecasts to try to keep us within that envelope of 2 degrees suggest that we need to be removing carbon emissions using technology to actually somehow like shovel it out of the atmosphere. Do you
technology that doesn't really yet exist? Yeah.
Well, there are rudimentary forms of it, and you know it exists, but not in any. It would be like taking a few grains of sand off.
Sailing a rowboat with a teaspoon. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. No, I mean, look, job 1, 2, and 3 is to stop pouring more water into this bathtub, okay? Because we've got to stop burning coal and gas and oil. And if we can do that, yes, then we can also work on expanding the size of the drain at the bottom of the bathtub. And that's what all these kind of carbon sucking technologies are. More promising, that's what happens if you make some changes to the way you do agriculture and land use so that soil can begin to soak up more carbon, for instance. But at the moment, with all those things, we're going in exactly the wrong way. It's very scary what's happening in the US. It's equally scary what's happening in Brazil right at the moment on climate terms, because we've stopped preserving the Amazon, and now it's full on deforestation again. And we're getting very near the limit where, the scientists think that the, rainforest can't survive in its current form.
And then add India and China to those equations, and other realms of the developing world where they're still building coal plants. My question is we talk a lot about, and we hear a lot about, a Green New Deal in a Biden administration, and potentially really progressive action that we might take here in this country. I guess the question is, how do you avoid cynicism or pessimism when so much of what happens to the planet is not just about what we might be doing if we were to get control of our government to actually take real action, but it requires collective action among so many different players.
Right. So we work all over the world, and we think about that constantly, and so the good news is there are people hard at work at this in every corner of the planet, and they're doing a good job. There are powerful movements all over the place. China is an interesting place. As you know, you're right, they're still building some coal-fired power, though not much, and they're putting up renewable energy at a huge pace. What's interesting about China is what they're doing in the rest of the world. They're kind of, as they do this Belt and Road initiative across Asia, they're putting up too much coal. But we haven't yet reached the point when one should just throw one's hands up in despair. The most interesting thing, in a sense, that any of the candidates for high office have said this fall is when Kamala Harris said her first thing is going to be to convene a meeting of all the high emitting countries around the world and get to work. And, that's what it's going to take. We need to go beyond Paris, and maybe she can do it. Who knows? There may come a point when it's fair game to give up. This is a problem that we don't get to keep working on forever. But we haven't gotten there yet. And this next decade, we still have some leverage to affect the outcome. What we do over the next 10 years will determine, I think, how high the temperature rises. And that in turn will determine just how bad things get. So
what does giving up mean? Because coming from you, that scares the crap out of me.
Well, maybe at some point I'm just going to go sit on the front porch and drink whiskey and, watch the sunset. But in the meantime, I'm going to keep, going to jail and doing what we can do, trying to keep, and I will say this, I mean, and I can say this better than anyone. I mean, there was a long period of time, 10 years maybe, when it felt like nobody was paying attention. Like if there was an article written in an important publication in the US about climate change for 10, 12 years, there was like an 80% chance it was written by me, you know? And that was a really horrible feeling. It was like having one of those nightmares where you can see something terrible going on, but you somehow can't get anybody else to turn around and look at it, you know? But now there's thousands upon thousands of great climate journalists hard at work, and tens of thousands of great organizers, local, national, international. There's a real fight going on. We didn't know 10 years ago when we started 350.org if there was actually going to be a real fight about climate or not, if we could bring a fight. That at least we know we can do. And so now the job is to win as much of it as we can.
And I like to think that, you know, your work inspired some of what I've written and some of the films I've made. And I just want to thank you for that inspiration.
Well, back at you. I've admired your work a lot, and it's really a pleasure to get to talk with you.
Well,
even if I didn't have such a high familial regard for the globe, it would be a great pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I thought we would bring it back home to Cape Ann, and just for folks who are watching this, what climate change means to them. I made a film called Sacred Cod, which was about the collapse of our iconic cod fishery and how warming has played a role in that story. And I also made a film called Lobster War, which is about the warming of the Gulf of Maine and how that's affecting the lobster industry. We've seen a 90% decline in the lobster catch south of Cape Cod, and we're seeing lobster move further north. Many of them will probably be hanging out in Canada in a few decades. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a bit about the impact to seaside communities such as Gloucester, and what they should expect in the coming decades to their shore and their livelihoods.
Well, one way to just think about it in your head is think about a beach like Crane Beach or the Singing Beach or someplace like that. Most of the East Coast, a beach slopes in at about 1 degree, something like that. That means that if you raise the sea level a foot, the ocean comes in almost 90 feet. We're talking about raising the sea level, if we're lucky, this century, 5 or 6 feet, I think. And if we're unlucky, way more than that. So just start thinking about what those communities look like. Start thinking about what it's like to live in a New England where winter is no longer really a thing, you know. Start thinking about the patterns of rain that we're used to, and then start factoring in storms that are unlike anything we've ever seen before. Those are the kind of physical changes that are coming. We can still prevent some of the worst of it if we really get to work, and we're also going to have to get our act together as societies, as democracies, to deal with that which we can no longer prevent. It's going to take everything that we've got to deal with that, and we better start now. And so, I mean, I think that the job of those of us who are older is to get as much done as we can so that we still pass on a world where there's some point in the next generation continuing this fight. I don't think we can win the fight in my time on the planet, but I think we can definitely lose it if we don't get our act together, at least some. And so that's how I think about it. Our job is to do enough so that, you know, my daughter and her generation have some chance at getting to continue this same fight going forward.
The last question I'll ask you, and I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you this, is I've heard your name mentioned as a potential Secretary of Interior or Secretary of Energy in a Biden administration. Would either of those interest you? I'll only
No,
take
I'd be
Sherman no.
I'd be bad at those, I think. I'm probably better working on the outside, and there's lots of people who are, if we can change our politics enough to allow there to be good people in doing those kind of jobs, then there's people who will be very good at them. That's not the problem. The problem is changing the balance of power enough that people can do the things that we know we need to do. It's not that there's some mysterious set of solutions that we're just waiting to find out about, or that some brilliant mind has to come up with. It's that we need to change that balance of power enough so that the fossil fuel industry can't stop us from doing what we know we need to do.
Thank you so much for all your time. We deeply appreciate it.
Thank you, guys, and it's a real pleasure to, Cape Ann's one of the most beautiful places on the planet. When I was a young boy in Lexington, I was a sea explorer, and we used to take our boat in and out of Scituate Harbor and in and out, all the time. And I really grew to love that part of the world and think of it with great fondness. Even though I've spent my whole life up in the mountains and forests, I think of you guys down there on the ocean a good deal, and we'll all do what we can to protect all these places.
I agree. It's one of my favorite places too. Great. Thanks so
Take
much.
care, y'all.
Okay.